should have put on my GenWell swag, just keep gloves like this swag. It's a little chilly here, and also I know my shirt is so good. No, I don't want it to distract from this. So anyhow, I should have done like some pre-checking to tech people. Then I use a website. Was that cool if I or do you have to do something?
You can shut that.
I will just do it. Oh, okay. So here we go. I told Pete during the hug, that I feel like Pete did on the conference here because Cedar, your opening really filled my reserves, and I feel really good just to hear the things you shared and the connections that you have are so beautiful. And I love hearing at the end of the day. I'm usually a numbers guy, so a lot of what I see at statistics is just numbers of things. But every time I go somewhere where I hear people share the stories of what's underneath the numbers, it really gives me life. Last year, when we presented results of the Canadian Social Connection Survey, actually, I didn't actually dive into the numbers at all. Because I'm bad at time management mostly. And I opened up our data set, and I just started with the open text data. And I got so fascinated by reading the stories of people's lives. To a question that I asked in 3 to 5 sentences, describe your social life, was just the opening to our survey. And so I got to question 1, and I found that so enriching. And I think it's so good to remember that at the end of the day, it's all of the individuals' lives that I think motivates us to all be here and that sort of thing. So in kind of the spirit of research, really rooting ourselves in that lived experience is really critical. And so I thought your opening did that very well. I also like how you said we're all things of stardust or something to that effect, that we're all of the stars. And that made me think of something from my Catholic upbringing of that you are dust and then to dust you shall return. You're the stuff of the earth. And I think that is such a beautiful sentiment because it means that we're all the same thing. There's actually no individual here. This is all one planet, one part of one solar system. We're probably better aligned to being something of a bacteria, all kind of one thing together, but yet we've convinced ourselves that we're just individuals. And our society, particularly Western society, has really taught us that we are individuals and that we are somehow distinct and separate from one another and somehow separable from one another. But I think increasingly Western science, which I represent as an academic, has learned that that is wrong. We go that we cannot be separated from our environments or from the people around us. And so with that realization of thinking about just the evolution of human beings, it's an inevitability that we're connected and that so much of who we are is completely dependent on that. If you think of our brain, for example, I like to often comment that ants with very small brains are able to get all the food they need, all the shelter they need. They're able to meet all their best basic needs and replicate, and just fine. Human beings have incredibly large brains per body mass, and much of the reason for that is because all our complexity is in our social relationships and the management of our social worlds. And so to me, it's always been a bit surprising that we don't have and very little time focusing on our social connection and well-being. Despite that, since 1946, the World Health Organization has said that health is not merely an absence of disease, but a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And yet our dualistic Western scientific approach, which separates out the mind and body, even within an individual, pretends that those two things are separate from one another, that mind and body are distinct. Even that has been a guiding framework in public health and medical science, which again, we're beginning to learn is totally bunk, it's made up. There is no separation between your body and your physical health and your mental health. And I would say there's no separation between those things and our physical health as well. So all of that is a long way to introduce a website. So this is the social connection guidelines .org is the website. You'll eventually be able to find a .ca and .com as well. And you'll eventually find the guidelines in French. I'm doing kind of a final editing. So this is the soft launch of the guidelines before we launch them in French as well. The guideline website, basically, I thought, yeah, I could walk you through the guidelines. I'll top down with it as well, but I also want to show you all of the bells and whistles underneath the website, because my challenge to you today is to take them and share them with somebody else, particularly if you can think of people of influence, of people who could use these guidelines to endorse and to motivate their work. In developing the guidelines, we've identified a number of reasons to have guidelines. I'd say first and foremost in their genesis, it was, as an early career researcher, when I connected with Pete, it's always interesting talking to people in communities and academic, because I'm like, oh yeah, the odds ratios say that this is a 3 times fold increase of death, and Pete is just like, what does that mean? What he's saying is this, what do these stats mean? And what do they mean to people's lives? And actually, when you get into those questions about like, what does this actually mean for people's lives, very little research is actually geared towards figuring out what can you actually tell people to help guide their lives. In statistics, we look at averages, we look at means, we don't look really at individuals. And so we can tell you what a group of people kind of look like, but what it means for people's lives is actually, we're not so good with that. And so that was really the motivation behind developing the guidelines. And when we first thought to do this, we thought, okay, well, we can find out how many friends does a person need. How many hours should you spend socializing? And then we could look at those statistics and try to figure that out. And so that's why we launched the Canadian Social Connection Survey in 2021, was to get some of the statistics and to look into that. And then in 2022, we were able to get funded this, what's called a Delphi study, and we recruited 120 of kind of the leading social health and community health experts across the globe. And they helped us kind of identify what are those things that we can tell people for their applied lives to live and to get through, and what would that look like. And so over practice, I was saying that we mostly arrived to, what some would say is kind of a common sense, just like anything anybody could tell you, right? I think the important things with the guidelines isn't so much that, we're telling you, we're preaching to the converted here for sure. It's not that we're telling you what to do. I think it's the process by which we went about it, because our goal is to bring that kind of authority, the scientific rigor to say, these are the best guidelines that we can give based on the available evidence that we have for how people can live healthier, happier, longer lives. So our guidelines, I guess the first thing to note about them is we kind of segregated them into 2 different types of guidelines. One is targeting individuals, and those would be individual guidelines, and ones that is targeted to communities. And in talking about communities, we define that very broadly. A workplace can be a community, a school can be a community, an apartment building could be a community, a neighborhood, a municipality, a society, a country, even a rural community. And so really we're speaking to these 2 different audiences to say, right off the bat, it takes everyone, right? Individuals, we know from loneliness research, from decades of trying to treat people who are experiencing loneliness, we find that it's actually a very treatment-resistant condition. To take somebody who is lonely and move them to a state of non-loneliness is very, very difficult. And that actually the best thing you can do is prevent loneliness and to stop it from originating in the first place. Because in a lonely individual, there's kind of a signal feedback that erodes self-esteem. And remember, there's no divide between self and other. That's a made-up construct that we use in our brains, that we're actually one. And so when you have low self-esteem, it really affects your social relationships. It creates what we call social vigilance, fear of rejection, fear of social threat, and causes you to withdraw. And of course, that then begins the cycle again. So it's really treatment resistant. And that's why you can't just act on, and this is, I think, one of the, things that we're realizing as a community of researchers and practitioners, is that you actually need to change the environments people are in as well. And that is both the built and physical environments that they need, but also the culture. And I think organizations like GenWell, that's been one of the great benefits of my partnership with GenWell, has been that realization that is what we need is a culture change where we give people the permission to talk to a stranger or to love their family or to tell their child every day that they loved and that they're your baby, right? I think that's beautiful. Unless we model that behavior, unless we do that, it's not going to happen. But individuals also won't do it if it's not the norm. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And so, when I first got into public health research, most of my research was actually around the use of condoms and sexual health. And condoms had taken kind of a decline in the early 2000s in the community I work with, and the reason for that was a bit political, but also social, biomedical advancements and that sort of thing. And I asked my supervisor, I'm like, am I making a mistake by studying this as an outcome? It's something that I'm interested in, and he made the point that he said, no, I think we should do everything. Right, like HIV and STIs are such horrible, horrible problems that like we shouldn't pick and choose. We should do everything we can, and I think that's reflected here in kind of this movement of that. Yes, we need individuals to work on changing their behavior, but unless we do everything, the system's just going to reinforce people back into their mobile behavior. They're just going to go back to do what they were, and so you really need a full court press on this. And so in the website, I'll walk you through a few things before diving into the individual guidelines, because I'd like, I took 10:45, right? Yes, yeah. I'd like to save most of the time for maybe some Q&As and talking about the guidelines if possible, so maybe you get your thinking caps on. But I'll walk you through some of the stuff that's on the website, because there's great opportunity to continue to refine and advance these. On the guideline website, we present the results of each individual guideline, which I said I'll show you. I walk you through those, both the individual and the community guidelines. In addition to that, we have a number of case studies that we've developed in partnership with organizations. So this case study, for example, is on the Pemberton's Men's Sheds program. We have this cool little, you can share your own idea for how you get connected. That's more participatory thing. We describe how the guidelines were made. And I think this is what I talked about, the good process by which we arrive to these common sense conclusions. Supporting the guidelines was no small effort. It has been, I kind of sometimes think I was a little dumb taking this on as a researcher, because I hadn't actually published a lot. And like in academia, there's a saying, publish or perish. And really is how my career is measured is kind of by the publications I help. But I haven't really published a lot, because over the past 3 years, we've published 49 evidence briefs to inform various components of the guidelines. Anytime we had a question of, oh, what is this? Should we make a guideline on this? Should this be included in the guidelines? Well, that just meant, another evidence brief for Kiffer's right. And so we published 49 evidence briefs supporting that. And then on top of that, we had this Delphi study, which was 4 rounds of back and forth with experts around brainstorming what could these guidelines include. That results into the list of something like 150 different statements or recommendations after we consolidated across those. And then those 150 statements, I can't believe the scientists who participated in this continued to participate. But they rated each guideline in terms of their endorsement of that guideline, in terms of their rated importance of that guideline. And then we consolidated those into the 12 guidelines that we have, and people rated their consensus each time, giving us pages and pages of qualitative data to go over, to review, to make sure that we're getting it right. And then we took that draft set of guidelines, those 12, and we took those to 6 key communities who experience marginalization, social isolation, social exclusion, typically including 2S LGBTQ folk, racialized, indigenous folk, migrants, immigrants, and refugees, and other kind of key populations. And we presented the guidelines to them and said, Blizzard got reactions to these. What are you finding? And that was 60 interviews in total. And then we took all that interview data and then again revised the guidelines. And then we went back to the experts and we said, okay, these are the guidelines that we have. Help us fine tune them. And so a very iterative process with some of, like I said, the greatest minds in community and social development that we have. And so that's the guidelines that will be presented before you. And of course, guidelines are just the beginning. Our hope with the guidelines is, that people will read them and take action. The policymakers will recognize the importance of them. But I think that really they're not just a behavior change tool, they're a systems change tool. If you look at alcohol research and nutrition research and exercise research, those fields were virtually undeveloped prior to the developments of public health guidelines for nutrition and alcohol. And we're continuing to learn. The latest alcohol guidelines, we thought 14 drinks per week was what was recommended, and now we're actually finding that something more like 2 drinks a week is recommended. And so, and all of that scientific advance that was only possible because we had guidelines to kind of guide and home to get social psychologists to care about what those everyday recommendations for people's lives would be. And so that's what we've been able to kind of accomplish with these guidelines, is a set of recommendations that we hope will be a catalyst for much more to do. And I think to be a justification, because if we can get organizations, governments across the globe to accept guidelines such as these, then that means that they're accepting responsibility to say that this is something that needs to be sought and pursued. And that means we can apply for funding and say, listen, just like we have to eat fruits and vegetables and therefore have nutrition programs, we need social connection and therefore need social connection programs. So those evidence briefs, all 49 of them, are published on the website. We definitely have the potential to do more of them. And then in those, I think I went through, counted using an automated process, but we counted our 49 articles reference about 4,700 peer-reviewed published studies. And so just an incredible amount of research. We've taken our very favorites, like we mostly just picked favorites of what I thought the most impactful research studies were. And we collated about 400 or 500 of those studies, around it's at 491, and included those in the guidelines. And you can actually go through, so you're like, okay, what is the evidence supporting one of our guidelines? You can actually filter through and find the 105 articles that support that guideline. So then you can actually go to the original sources and say what those resources are. As I mentioned with the evidence briefs, I'll just show you those. Those up in the evidence brief library, it's actually a searchable library. And so you could do things like, type in how many friends do I need? And it'll show evidence briefs that are relevant to friendship. It's not super AI embedded because we didn't have the money for AI. But certainly we were able to create kind of search so you could go through. And these case studies, as I mentioned, are, I think, some of the most important elements of the guidelines, because it's looking to highlight what are people doing in community to actually make these guidelines a reality, and what is the evidence supporting those. And one that because I like biking, so I get to choose what is featured on the feature book. So I love the city of Montreal. Anybody from Montreal? I just love Montreal, and I also love their bike lane network. And I think that this illustrates as a nice one because it's showing how even a policy like biking or how you construct your city really influences that. And so each of these case studies not only had a description of the specific intervention. That's supposed to, I guess the screen is too small, so it's pushing the sidebars to the bottom. But normally the sidebar will appear on the side and has information about the intervention itself, but also the research, some key studies that support that case study to show that there's evidence behind the things that you're doing. And so that's the case studies feature. And so now to the guidelines themselves. Each set of guidelines, as I mentioned, is kind of composed of 6 guidelines for individuals and 6 guidelines for communities. This index page kind of lists them all. and kind of gives you a sense of what they are. I think we'll go ahead and run through the individual guidelines and then show you what a guideline is so that you know how to navigate and see what's on these guideline pages. But the first guideline is almost painfully simple, I guess. It's make social connection a priority throughout your life. And each guideline has kind of that main statement, what is the short, catchy, what is the thing to remember. And that has a very brief rationale. Social connection is a basic human need for people of all ages, but meeting your social needs often requires time, effort, and intentionality, right? And that's why we have to make it a priority. It's because social connection is not easy. And then each guideline has these supporting kind of statements that are kind of sub-guidelines within that. Be thoughtful and aware of how much or what types of social connection you're getting, whether you're getting enough social connection. And while recognizing that relationships are not always easy, strive to pursue meaningful, satisfying, and positive connections with others. Again, so probably not revolutionary for most of you, but I think to then be able to go into this guideline and kind of understand that is the guideline, but then we also give you a rationale, to explain why the experts felt that this was a guideline, and worthy of kind of inclusion in the guideline. We connect the evidence briefs from those 49 evidence briefs that support that guideline, so you can kind of get a good sense of it. We highlight a few case studies that are supported or showing how that guideline's being done in action. GenWell being one of them right here for this one, because GenWell is in Canada making social connection a priority. And that's a key supportive research of kind of key studies that we've highlighted in our research repository. And then if you're really kind of geeky or nerdy, we also break down our expert evaluation of the guideline, where the evidence sits now, where we need to refine the benefits better. So we tell you actually the confidence, how confident are we in this guideline, so that we've used the quality of the evidence. We talk about the balancing of benefiting of harms, because something that we were conscious of in the guideline development process is that your guidelines can create expectations, they create responsibility and accountability. And what happens when somebody strives and maybe they're unable to achieve it? Does that influence or hurt their self-esteem? Surprisingly, there's very little, if any, research on kind of these kind of negative aspects. And so, we try to evaluate the evidence that's there and say, in the balance of our scientific opinion, this is where we think the potential harms might be. This is how likely we think those harms are. We look at these alignment with values and preferences, because not all communities will receive the guidelines the same way. It would be impacted in the same way. So really thinking about equity-oriented lens of how is this aligned with societal expectations. How feasible is it actually to do this? Some are more feasible, and some are more feasible for more people, and some are more feasible for less people. And then how certain we are. And then everyone includes this kind of overall assessment of how strong of our recommendation we have and what is their quality of evidence. This is the first, as Ike has said, the first global public health guidelines on social connection. And so it's only the beginning. I think over the next 5 years, we'll maybe issue an update to say, okay, here's what we've learned in the past 5 years, just as we updated nutrition guidelines and exercise guidelines along the way. And so that's a breakdown of what the guidelines are. In terms of the individual guidelines, as I said, there were 6 of them. Number 1, make social connection a priority throughout your life, which we've just gone over. The second one is to cultivate social confidence in yourself and others. And this one of the guidelines was one of the most difficult to kind of figure out how to crack, right, and to do well. Because of the role of that human interaction with one another, is that so much of our social experience really has to do with our own mental model ourselves. Scientists, if you talk to psychologists, they'll refer to that sometimes as attachment style. And there's a lot of internal barriers that people experience to connection, that fear of rejection, the fear of putting yourself out there. And one of the challenges with cultivating social confidence is it's really hard for an individual to do it. It's usually not something that somebody can do on their own. And so coming up with this guideline was quite tricky, but it really appears to be really critical that people, wherever you're at, you find the next step that you could take. So in the evolution of our guidelines, this was kind of important, just that we didn't end up saying you need 5 friends. or you need to spend 24. This is what our data said. My data set said 3 to 5 friends is where loneliness kind of minimizes. We saw 24 hours a week of social connection is where loneliness is minimized. Those didn't make it into the guidelines in the end because there's some personal variability and not everybody is ready. Could you imagine being a socially isolated person who's in the utter throes of loneliness and being told you need 24 hours of social connection this week? Get on it, buddy. No, that's not realistic, and so that's not the guideline that we put forward. But people need to think about what am I comfortable with. Maybe all I'm comfortable with is going and sitting in a public space, sitting at a bench and just getting used to being around people, right? That might be all somebody is ready for. And so helping people think through, just think about what is that next step for me? It might not be the life of the party. It might just be something small. Our third guideline, and kind of the next 3 guidelines are really oriented around Juliet Bohlenstadt's model of the structure, function, and quality of relationships. And so regarding the structure of relationships, we recommend that you build a strong social network with a variety of kinds of relationships. Certainly your most intimate connections, your spouse, your best friend, your parents, siblings, and children, those are going to be the most influential relationships on your health. But a strong social network isn't just composed of them, because you will lose spouses through divorce and death. You will move away from your best friend to get a new job. Your life will change in ways that is unpredictable. You need to always keep kind of your social network fresh, and so that means maintaining a network where you are open to social connection with strangers and acquaintances. And not to mention that there's now fairly robust evidence that shows even those minimal social interactions play a really important sense of, give you a really important sense of safety, belonging, social cohesion, social capital that makes you feel connected to the people around you. And that makes you feel good, right? Even listening to the openings this morning, right? Just felt good, just hearing somebody talk about one of their relationships. I didn't even need to have that relationship myself. I just felt good hearing about it. And I think that speaks to that our social minds are really geared and attended towards being social creatures. And then once you have the social network, you got to do something with it. You got to actually attend to those relationships. And so our next guideline is invest in getting enough social connection. Now, we don't exactly tell you what enough is, because that, again, is going to vary from person to person. We know what we call social homeostasis is this level that each person has a different set point for how much social connection they need to feel fulfilled. Because loneliness is that subjective evaluation of the difference between how much social connection you want or need and how much you're getting. But that want or need level is different for everyone. Like I said, we did find in our data that people who spent 24 hours per week socializing, that's when their loneliness tended to minimize. And that actually matches nomadic and pastoralist societies about how much time in the course of their week they spend socializing. But certainly in contemporary life is much more complex than that. And there's a lot of interpersonal variation on this need for social connection. So enough, I think, is like we tried to give you advice and recommendations within these guidelines over how do you know you're getting enough. And so you can kind of see one of the things we've done in the guidelines, in addition to providing a rationale and our judgments of them, we've also provided these additional considerations. Additional considerations are things that we acknowledge as being really core or critical to the interpretation of the guidelines and for your understanding of them. And so, for example, in getting enough social connection, one of our additional considerations is talking of the structure, function, and quality of relationships. And so regarding the structure of relationships, we recommended you build a strong social network with a variety of kinds of relationships. Certainly your most intimate connections, your spouse, your best friend, your parents, siblings, and children, those are going to be the most influential relationships on your health. But a strong social network isn't just composed of them, because you will lose spouses through divorce and death. You will move away from your best friend to get a new job. Your life will change in ways that is unpredictable. You need to always keep kind of your social network fresh. And so that means maintaining a network where you are open to social connection with strangers and acquaintances. And not to mention that there's now fairly robust evidence that shows even those minimal social interactions playing really important sense of, give you a really important sense of safety, belonging, social cohesion, social capital that makes you feel connected to the people around you. And that makes you feel good, right? Even listening to the openings this morning, I just felt good just hearing somebody talk about one of their relationships. I didn't even need to have that relationship myself. I just felt good hearing about it. And I think that speaks to that our social minds are really geared and attended towards being social creatures. And then once you have the social network, you got to do something with it. You got to actually attend to those relationships. And so our next guideline is invest in getting enough social connection. Now, we don't exactly tell you what enough is, because that, again, is going to vary from person to person. We know what we call social homeostasis is this level that each person has a different set point for how much social connection they need to feel fulfilled. Because loneliness is that subjective evaluation of the difference between how much social connection you want or need and how much you're getting. But that want or need level is different for everyone. Like I said, we did find in our data that people who spent 24 hours per week socializing, that's when their loneliness tended to minimize. And that actually matches thematic and pastoralist societies about how much time in the course of their week they spend socializing. But certainly in contemporary life is much more complex than that. And there's a lot of interpersonal variation on this need for social connection. So enough, I think, is like try to give you advice and recommendations within these guidelines over how do you know you're big enough. And so you can kind of see one of the things we've done in the guidelines, in addition to providing their rationale and our judgments of them, we've also provided these additional considerations. Additional considerations are things that we acknowledge as being really poor or critical to the interpretation of the guidelines or for your understanding of them. And so, for example, in the getting enough social connection, one of our additional considerations is talk about the benefits of solitude, right? We know actually from studies of young children that when children actually spend all of their time in the context of social interactions, they actually have lower well-being than children forget about 20% of their waking hours alone to pursue self-expression, to pursue self-interest and that sort of thing. And so actually realizing that, not all of their time is to be spent. Also talk about quality over quantity, right? It's one thing to spend time in the presence of other people. It's another to ensure that time is a high quality. And so when I talk about getting enough social connection, one of the things we talk about is that it's enough such that you have people to turn to. Are your relationships of sufficient strength and quality so that you actually are able to turn to others? And then after investing, so that's the function of relationships, spending the time necessary. Our next guideline was maintain and deepen your relationships with others. And with this guideline, we talk about striving for that close circle of supportive people that you can trust and count on, having mutually beneficial relationships, that's being really critical. I talked to you with Pete yesterday, we talked about that not every one of your relationships needs to be this deep emotional relationship. It's okay to have friends that what you do with them is you go grab a beer and you shoot the breeze, right? Those are okay types of social interaction. There's nothing wrong with it. As long as both people are getting the same thing out there and wanting the same thing out there. And so this guideline is I think sort of an important step to move you out of focusing about what is the purpose of social connection for me, to start thinking about how you build a quality relationship. And that is turning your attention to what is good for both of us and what do they need as well. And so these guidelines, do focus on things like learning and practicing the skills necessary to navigate social challenge, to navigate your relationships with other people, and to make sure that you're really striving to achieve that. And then finally, another one of the more contentious guidelines to the development process was how we dealt with technology. Because on the one hand, we have seen social media have a profound adverse influence on young people. Internal data from Instagram shows that just 30 minutes of social media use on their platform is enough to create addiction in a younger person. That's their own internal studies that was inadvertently released because they redacted using a digital highlighter instead of actually starting the test. So that wasn't supposed to be released, but it's something we learned that the piece of lawsuit. So we know that these social media platforms appear to have a toxic effect on individuals. But at the same time, if you're a member of the 2S LGBT community, if you're somebody literally with a disability, you're homebound and you can't get out, sometimes technology is the only lifeline you have. In our data from the Canadian Social Connection Survey, we also found that the people that you have the most social connection with, so people you have the strongest emotional attachments to, are also those people who you interact with the most frequently using text messages. And for me, this is very true. I had maybe 3 or 4 different meme groups where the people, I love them all for different reasons, but there's these people that we send memes to each other all day long. And those are the people I also talk with most frequently in person. So thinking about the tension between technology use and in-person social connection is in some ways an artificial one. It's actually not true that that they're necessary conflict. They can be tools to help you maintain those positive, healthy relationships in your life. The challenge is getting people to use them as tools that will benefit their social life, and not letting me send endless memes to my friends without arranging ever an in-person time to connect with them, and to making sure that in-person connection is still part. And we do review in our evidence for this brief that there is a ton of research that shows that face-to-face does win out over all other forms of social connection. There's something about the human brain, the human social relationship that does require an in-person embodied physical interaction. Maybe they're experimental, maybe there's lots of biological things going on. But they've actually done studies that look at people in brain scans, and they see that their brains actually synchronize in person in a way that they don't when they're participating only virtually. So it does appear to be something in our biological nature that those social connections are actually meaningful in person. And so, with some battling over the language of what this guideline looks like, we did get endorsements from. I guess I didn't explain how that works. It's like in the guideline development process, 85% of people with high content expertise needed to endorse the guideline. And then 75% of all experts had to endorse the guideline in order for it to be included. And so those were our kind of inclusion criteria for defining guidelines. And so those are the individual guidelines. And of course, as I mentioned though, we don't actually expect individuals to be able to do this alone. It's anti-theoretical to the concept of social connection as peak connection, which by nature takes 2 people. And so then the next question is how we build the environments in which people can thrive for social connection. And we've developed 6 kind of mirror guidelines, to some extent mirror guidelines for here as well. Just as we've told people to prioritize social connection, we've told governments to do their role in educating, empowering individuals to be aware of the importance of social connection in their life. And that means playing an active role and frankly not leaving it to underfunded nonprofits to do, right? It's time to give money to the organizations that are actually trying to make these guidelines a reality in people's lives. The second guideline is to foster emotional and social development. And usually when people think about SEL, social and emotional learning programs, they think about it as early intervention. And certainly we do need early intervention programs in which young people are given the tools to manage and understand their emotions, and to, while their brain is still neuroplastic, to kind of change those behaviors, and with the help of adults do that. But then also this is something that people need throughout their life course, and so that's one of the innovations of this guideline as we talk about, that actually across your life you need to be fostering the emotional skills. So if you're having a child, you need to understand what are those musts of disconnection going to be like after I'm a new mother or a new father, and how is that going to be, and how am I going to navigate that? Because we don't do enough to educate parents of that. If I'm getting into retirement, or if I'm losing a job, there needs to be resources to teach people how to navigate these new challenges of life. If you look at trajectories in loneliness, it appears that about 50% of the variability in loneliness appears to be heritable, meaning it's largely genetic and biological. And so what matters is what happens to you in the course of your life. And so you may have a predisposition to be lonely, but never experience loneliness in your life because of the way your life unfolded. But these major life events throughout your life really seem to be important in triggering people's experience of loneliness, in which they achieve kind of a new set point level of loneliness. And so job loss, loss of a partner, loved one, loss of spouse, moving to a new place, all of those things are potential triggers. And one of the periods at which we see this most commonly happen is when young people go away to college. If you look at trajectories of loneliness, it increases from into young adulthood and then is essentially stable. So however you are, however lonely you are, kind of right around college is basically how lonely that person is probably going to be throughout their life in current state, at least without intervention. And so really thinking about, are we doing a good enough job preparing young people for the challenge of social connection? But that is true for every stage of life. And so when we say foster healthy and social development, we're not just talking about currently funded SEL programs in elementary schools. We're saying this needs to be something that we are thinking about, that we are always developing, because there will be new challenges and experiences for people to encounter, and they need to be supported through those. The third guideline is to make social connection a priority in policies and practices. And in this, we really adopt a social health in all policies approach. And in this kind of framework, because what we say is that every policy has the potential to influence people's social connections. If you're an employer, and I remember working at JCPenney's when I was one of my first jobs, I remember how lonely lunch was. I could be all on the floor interacting with customers and interacting with my coworkers, but then you go to lunchroom because you weren't allowed to take your lunch at the same time as other people. And that was a policy that was intended to, manage the economic costs of running a business. But that decision had a negative influence on the social connection of the employees and our relationships with one another. And so really think about what are all the ways, even a speed limit down a busy street, changing that speed limit from 20 miles per hour to 50 miles per hour is going to divide that community in half because people don't like to cross busy roads. So these sorts of policies all have the potential. They won't always, but have the potential to. And so just like as we consider equity in all policies and gender-based analysis in all policies, we also need to be doing the similar thing with social connection in all policies. And so this is helped us all see, but also on a programmatic or practical level. The decisions that we make of how we bring people together need to be putting at their forefront. What is it going to do to our social trust in one another? What is it going to do to our comfort levels around other people, and so on? The fourth community guideline is to design environments for connection and invest in social events, activities, and programs. While certainly people can connect in a variety of different types of environments, I think one of the beautiful things about human beings is our diversity, built adaptability, and that something about our brain architecture allows us to adapt to different social situations. Nevertheless, if we actually want to optimize people's social connections and to change the culture, it really seems that you have to do some work to change the environments that we have in. When we ask people about the barriers to social connection they face, so many people mentioned, I have roommates and we don't allow friends into our apartment. Or, I live in a studio apartment and I have nowhere to meet because my building lobby common area is always booked, or it's too parked to book, or it costs something to book. Or, third spaces have been in decline when a threat was their libraries, cafes, restaurants. I hear increasingly so. The economic costs of socializing are profound and really serving as a great barrier. If every time I want to socialize, it's going to cost me $120 in alcohol, drinks, and food at the local pub, then that's going to, for a large segment of the population, close off those opportunities. And so we need to be thinking about those spaces in which do we provide opportune spaces, and do we program those well? Are those resources being well utilized? Are they being leveraged to create a culture of social change? Or are we just like setting them up and then kind of letting them kind of fizzle out? So really that mirror program would build these good spaces and then use them well. And there's lots of great case studies. I'd say this design environment piece is one of the ones we had a lot of the great case studies about, because I think long before social connection really became a priority, we already had a growing movement to age-friendly communities and some of this other building infrastructure work. Finally, for number 5 is improve accessibility and inclusion for all people. I think that this guideline, again, it's one of those common sense things that if your goal is to create inclusion and connection, then you need to be inclusive, right? Like that doesn't seem like, but there are a million different ways in which people's various identities, their various physical capabilities, their social capabilities influence their ability to connect in an environment. And unless we attend to those and celebrate those aspects of an individual and make sure that we're accommodating, that it's not really going to be effective. I think this is all the more important in an era in which many corporate and political bodies are starting to backtrack on EDI closing EDL divisions and that sort of thing, is that actually that's the wrong direction to go. We actually got some pushback from our colleagues south of the border on this guideline because they said, this might make an American government unwilling to adopt your guidelines because they don't like this idea of accessibility, inclusion, and equity. And I think the consensus of the experts was like, so be it. They'll figure it out. I don't know if we're not. And finally, the last one. This one, I admit, is a little self-serving. As an academic researcher, you'll never read a meta-analysis or a study that doesn't say, further research is needed. Understand the impact, and that is true. And when you're consulting 120 experts, there's one guideline that was rated very high. And this is it. But it is actually quite true is that we do need to measure and make progress. Because we spend a lot of money and we do a lot of things that don't have the right impacts. And we need to make sure that the resources that we're being entrusted with from our communities are going to good use and get used well. Right now, we spend about 5% of medical budgets. In DC, the minister told me it was 3% on prevention. We know that prevention is far more effective than treatment for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and that loneliness is a very difficult condition to treat. But that's across all medical outcomes. 80% of your health has nothing to do with what happens in exam rooms or in clinics or in hospitals. 80% of your health. That means only 20% of what we think of when we think of doctor shortages. All that money, the billions of dollars that we spend, is actually only influencing a very marginal proportion of your health. The rest is about 30 to 40% is your environmental influences in health and your social, and then the remainder is your social determinants of health. And the most important social determinant of health is your connections to people. We look at data like social mobility and poverty and neighborhood residents. Having connections across those divides is the best, strongest predictor whether or not somebody will be socially mobile, whether they'll be able to achieve their economic dreams and visions. So if we think about the fundamental social determinant of health is people's relationships, connections, the way we support each other, the way that we are generous with our contacts and resources, that is really where so much of it is at. And all of that is enabled by social connection. If you want to read a really interesting evidence brief by Dr. Marina Ache that in the UBC School of Economics wrote it, talks about the ways in which really social connection is an economic key. And that actually if we invest in social connection that you get all these benefits of entrepreneurship, of great social connections and environments. And I really think that we haven't scratched the surface on the research on that. Economists have not kept, they're still, counting pennies or whatnot, deciding whether inflation is good or bad. Eventually that research will be forthcoming and more often, and I think it will be a powerful motivator. We're actually on the recommended public health guidelines for social connection, and certainly hope that Canada, through GenWell, will be able to adopt these guidelines and then really get them into awareness. But remember, my challenge to you is share this with somebody who you think will have influence and power. If you want to contribute to some extent to the guidelines, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. At the bottom, several of these pages, case studies, for example. If you've got a great case study of something you think is important, you can share it with us. So I'll just show you this real quick, just so you know how you would get all it. And that's my email address if you want to email me. So you can say what you want to do. If you represent an organization or nonprofit or other entity that wants to provide your endorsement of these guidelines, I really want to say that this is really important, that there be broad. If we want governments to uptake these guidelines, they first need to see that there's a political rationale, that there's a social rationale. So if you work in an organization that could endorse these guidelines, provide their endorsement, you might not agree with every single thing in there. Remember, these are first draft guidelines in the world. But if you think in principle they're really good, we love your endorsement. We'll put you up as a logo. As a member endorsing organization, we'll list your content alongside the evidence briefs. We'll help promote that through the website. You can submit research articles. If you're a researcher and you have research that you believe supports and endorses the guidelines, you can submit your research studies. If you have a case study, as I mentioned, you can submit your case study. Tell us what you're doing Each of these kind of resources, has a series of prompts that'll ask you the questions or ask you to provide the information that we need in order to get that case study online. If you have an additional resource, also I didn't even show this, but on each of the guideline pages, there's probably 10, 15. Oh, this is drama. Oh, I walked out of word. On each of the guideline websites, there's all these additional resources at the bottom that link to some of the great ongoing things that you want to know more about how to make that guideline a reality either in your life or in your community. These additional resources, a lot that play a role. We've read the discussion of that. So you can provide an additional resource. If you think something's missing from our guidelines in the additional considerations or something like that, the additional considerations are stuff that we developed through the guideline process, but they're not officially part of the guidelines. So we can still add to those we'll be just a committee to decide that those, or if you just have other general feedback about the website or about content or about really anything, you would just want to get in touch. This is our partner portal. And we want you to be part of this process as well. So that's accessible through the website. I don't know how we got to this. Oh, that's so put the link. But so that's the guidance. Thank you.